Okay.
So, Gary, are you ready?
Yes. Are you going to control the slides?
Yeah, I will introduce you, then I'll pass the floor to you, then you begin to share. So now
okay, thank you. Sure.
I'm sharing. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, now it's 9 o'clock. Let's see, let's get started. Hello, good morning. And also good afternoon to our European colleague and good evening to our Asian colleagues. So today we are very happy, very honored to invite Professor Gary Parker come here, talk about the continental shelf formation with the seaward migrating planiform. Okay, so before I introduce Gary, and I want to say all our previous talk. Gary's talk today mark as number 50 this year, 2021 alone. So last year we have 35. So totally 85 talks. All 85 talks have already or will be archived on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to use these resources for your research, for your class, for your education purpose. So this is one of the very good byproduct from the pandemic. So we try to turn the lemon to the lemonade. So, beside the YouTube channel, we also maintain a Source to Think Twitter account. So we update all the news talks. So you can follow us on Twitter, Source to Think, very simple. And next week, next Wednesday, we will invite Professor Maria Santos from Zurich, talk about social ecologic on the Delta system. So because most of us talk about the natural science, and we need to understand what the social and ecological impact of the dramatic change over the global Delta systems. So please mark your calendar and come here next Wednesday at the same time. And Gary is a professor at UIUC, Urban Champaign, University of Illinois. And also, I will point out, he sent me his brief CV, but he didn't mention that, but I just add in. He is an AGU fellow for many years, and also a member of the National Academy of Science in US. And as you can see, he working in Canada for 5 years, and also almost 25 years in University of Minnesota. And then from 2005 to here, another 15, 16 years, gosh, time fly, he moved to the UIUC. So Gary, we all know, is famous for the experimental numerical and experimental model, theoretical also, about subaerial and submarine river delta sediment transport, the sequence stratigraphy, particularly for us to understand the formation of a continental shelf, the planiform, a delta. So I think many of us is looking forward to Gary's talk. So Gary, now I stop sharing. Now you can sharing and put a presentation mode.
Okay, before starting to share, I thank Paul for turning this period of COVID, when we can't actually meet in person, into something that's better than what we did before COVID, and that is have a series of meetings that make a permanent record that other researchers and students can access easily. I thank this effort, and it's been a big effort for you. Okay.
Thank you.
I host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, let me see. I'm sorry. It should be a call. Okay, now.
Okay, try again. Screen sharing.
Yes. Very good.
Okay. There is a ribbon that says mute stop video security that's in the way. Can you see it moving or do you not see it on your end?
Yeah, I see everything good. Please go ahead.
Okay. So
can you click?
Go on. Okay, there we go. I'm going to talk about the role of saltwater and waves in continental shelf formation with a seaward migrating cliniform. And I'm not talking about the cliniform in front of a delta, but I'm forming about the belt shelf that forms along many margins, such as the case that John Anderson and colleagues demonstrated quite clearly in the case of the Gulf of Mexico. My co-author is Professor Toshiki Iwasaki of Hokkaido University. The original idea for this came toward the end of stratiform, and then I spent many years unable to do anything because I didn't have the skills to solve it. And Professor Iwasaki, when he was my postdoc, brought exactly the skills and showed great originality and determination to finally bring the idea to fruition. Here we have Lake Baikal. It's a freshwater lake. It's deep. It's gone through many cycles of lake level variation. There's a bulge at the Selenga Delta here, but otherwise there's no continuous shelf. Maybe the difference is saltwater versus freshwater. Okay. Shelves on clastic margins, whether narrow or wide, tend to form a smooth bench that connects delta to delta. And there's one of our benches right here. It's narrow in some places, wider in other places, narrow on active margins, wider on passive margins, but it tends to be continuous. I note we don't consider carbonate margins in this talk. We're considering clastic margins. Go ahead. Our hypothesis is that dissolved salt plays a major role in the subaqueous construction of continuous shelves. Now, first, I'd like to start off with a point of view of sequence stratigraphy. High stand shelves are drowned coastal plains. We don't say this is wrong, but we say there's something else. Okay, here's our coastal plain, continental plate, ocean plate, and there's sea level, reworking to create a shelf. As sea level goes up, the shelf moves here. Up, here, then down, then down. Then at low stand, the idea is maybe there's no shelf. So we're not claiming that this idea is wrong, but we're going to add something. The hypothesis is if there were no shelf at low stand, which is the case of still stand, then subaqueous processes would start to make one. And if a substantial margin is not visible at low stand, it's simply because low stand wasn't long enough to construct it substantially. That's the hypothesis. Okay, a few examples. There is a bench-shaped cliniform that runs the length of Italy. It's not a true continental margin because much of the Adriatic was exposed at low flow, but it's a kind of proto-shelf that shows this continuous belt-like feature that we're referring to. And I think we can use it as an example. This is from Trincardi and Friends. Okay, In this view, we can see the belt-like shelf all the way down. We can see from seismics the outward migration of the cliniform that corresponds to a belt-like protoshelf. We can see the patterns of geostrophic flow, which means that input from rivers, small rivers, can be smeared along the entire margin here to create a continuous bench. And all of this is actively building out in the Holocene, where roughly speaking, where it still stands. What about freshwater lakes? That's the eel margin, saltwater, and it has a shelf. It's an active margin, so it's narrow, but it's there, what I learned in stratiform. Here's the Adriatic. Saltwater with a protoshelf. There's Lake Baikal, freshwater and no continuous shelf. The biggest source of sediment to the Lake Baikal is the Selinga Delta. It shows up as a big bulge, but it doesn't spread laterally to form a continuous shelf. Tributary, 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 away from the Selinga River bulge. No sign of a shelf at all. It drops off into deep water. And the lake is millions of years old, so it's had enough time. Again, some bathymetry that shows a bulge at the delta, but no continuous bench-like shelf. So the idea is maybe in the case of freshwater, you don't build shelves. And we hypothesized that the difference between the freshwater case and the seawater case is a salt barrier. Dissolved salt makes water heavier. And this heavy salt water inhibits the formation of conditions that are good for construction of shelves at still stand. Here's an example of a freshwater lake. It's Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. Sediment-laden water flows into the lake. Sediment-laden water is heavier than the sediment-free water of the freshwater lake. So the flow plunges, there's the plunge point, with garbage pulled toward it, to form a bottom turbidity current, which then has been filling the bottom of the lake for hundreds of thousands of years. Freshwater, plunge, make a turbidity current, run all the sediment to deep water. So here's the idea. The sediment-laden river comes in. The coarser fraction of the load deposits out as a proximal delta. But what might make a pro-delta instead plunges, sediment-laden water being heavier than sediment-free water, down to form a turbidity current, which forms deep layers of turbidites at the bottom of the lake. And this is also what Lake Baikal shows. There's over 4 kilometers of turbidites at the bottom, muddy turbidites. So sediment is not hanging around in the nearshore zone to form a shelf. It's going to deep water. There's a salt barrier. In the case of the ocean, the river sediment concentration must exceed something like 40,000 milligrams per liter for plunging. This is less in brackish environments, but it's still pretty high. There are not that many rivers around the world that plunge at flood flows. This is James Savitsky's hyperpickel flows. This is an example of the Yellow River, a river that carries among the highest sediment concentrations in the world, plunging into the Bohai Sea. So it can occur in salt water. And Savitsky and friends have delineated how often it occurs. And the whole point of it is the vast majority of rivers never reach hyperpictal conditions when flowing into saltwater. Some do. So most rivers flows form a hypopictal surface flume as they flow into the ocean. We haven't lost the sediment to deep water. So the mud does not run into deep water, but deposits in the near shown as it rains out, abetted by flocculation. Here's a beautiful image I got from James Savitsky showing the Adriatic margin during flooding. And there are many small rivers putting in sediment. They're not making individual deltas along shelf or along margin processes are creating a continuous bench or protoshelf. Again, the seawater is heavy. The river flows don't plunge. They form surface plumes, which are amalgamated by along shelf processes such as geostrophic flows. Now, not all margins are due to the deposition of mud by hypopictal flows at still stand. But there are many cases, and some of the more famous cases is, again, John Anderson and friends' Texas mud belt, where this mud in the satellite photo neatly corresponds to the location of the shelf itself. Here's the mud belt in the Yellow Sea, receiving sediment from the Yellow River. And there's another mud belt on the Amazon River from Bob Aller and friends. So these are fairly common around the world. Again, I'm not saying this is the only way to make shells, but this is one way to do it at still stand, even at still stand, which is fairly common around the world. Okay, here's the conceptual model. This is as far as I got many years ago. River comes in, hypopictal plume, sediment rains out proximally, sediment builds up to wave base, wave action knocks the sediment toward the edge and creates a bench-like migrating linoform. So we have a diagram here showing a river delta, a shoreline, a shelf slope rollover, and a base of slope from A to A prime, as engineers like to say. There are two deltas here. They contribute sediment and make bulges, but along shelf processes change this into a bench that corresponds to a shelf with a rollover that can prograde seaward. So the result is we hypothesize salt aids the subaqueous construction of shelves. And again, I think it's a little hard to find the right examples on freshwater lakes. We need a freshwater lake that's deep and old. And there are not too many candidates, but rift lakes are good ones. The Lake Baikal is in a Hofgraben. If we had data for Lake Malawi, we could probably show the same thing. It won't work for the Great Lakes because there's very little sediment input into the Great Lakes. Oop. So we have still stand shelf constructions such as the Texas mud belt in saltwater, bulge at Selinga Delta, but no continuous shelf at Lake Baikal. Okay. Until now, everything has been talk. And it was only until my co-author Professor Iwasaki came to work with me that I found somebody who had the skills to turn the talk into real science. And so I deeply appreciate him. Some of the ideas: sediment-laden fresh water from the river. It's still lighter than salt water. We get various double diffusive and fingering processes plus flocculation to get sediment to rain out, and it does so. It builds this surface up toward wave base. Whereas in a hyperpictal flow, where the sediment-laden water is heavier than the lake water, we plunge to put in a deep turbidity current. Hypo, hyper. Okay. Our numerical simulation is a vast simplification, but it's still filled with lots of goodies. We run it at a laboratory scale model. We don't have the resources to run it at field scale. We consider a cross-shelf vertical cross-section. So we don't do the along-shelf processes, but we know in nature, geostrophic flows and others should serve to do that. We use an unsteady Reynolds average model for the flow and single grain size and cohesionless sediment. First, I show a video of sediment raining out from a hypopictal flow. As it rains out, you can see that it creates a very weak turbidity current on the bottom. Okay, here's some computed dynamics of hypo and hyperpictal flows. So the hypo is on top, and you can see sediment coming in on the surface, hypopictal. So the sediment-laden freshwater is lighter than the seawater. The hyperpictal run, where the sedimented freshwater is heavier than the sediment-free freshwater, and we see plunging. And let's see how this works. There's our hyperpictal flows running out into deep water and depositing sediment in deep water. We're getting some broad deposits here. Here's a hypopictal flow where the sediment tends to gather. Right here, you can see a protoshelf starting to form. So this shows the hypopictal case and the hyperpictal case. The hyperpictal case puts some sediment on a shelf-like feature, but most of it goes into deep water, whereas the hypopictal case puts most of its sediment on this protoshelf. Now, hyperpictal flows can either be erosional or depositional, but hypopictal flows are predominantly depositional and proximal in terms of along the shelf. Okay, we want to look at self-generated shelf morphodynamics, as we like to say. This kind of continental shelf is the largest bed form in the world. So we have our hypopictal flow, sediment rains out, sediment deposits upward until wave base, and then wave base can move sediment offshore to create a migrating clinoform. So the sediment deposition from the hypopictal flow builds up the shelf. The shelf surface is affected by waves. A wave-supported turbidity current transports the sediment from the shelf to the slope. And these processes lead to shelf development with a seaward migrating clinoform. There's our waves. We put these in waves in a fairly simple way. And here's our deposition driven toward the continental rise. Now, we put in repeated cycles of pulsed floods and storms. We have repeated cycles of short-term fluvial sediment input due to major flood events, along with the long-term effect of waves due to repeated storm events. And we use fairly simple models to capture these. But for example, this is a randomized record of wave height and flow discharge. And this way, we borrowed this diagram from Tchaikovsky and friends. Okay. Here's our events coming by. Hypopictal flows, deposit rework by storms. And you can see a bench working its way up toward wave base and gradually prograding offshore. You can also see some nice mud waves or cyclic steps, which come out autogenically from the model. They don't scale properly with the mud waves that are seen on the continental slope in the field because it's a small model, but we think the physics are likely to be the same, at least for some of them. There's debate about these mud waves. One is that they're so-called cyclic steps for alternating subcritical and supercritical turbidity currents, and one is that they're associated with internal waves. We haven't modeled internal waves here. This shows the development of our proto-shelf, up, 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 then outward. And of course, we can't make detailed comparisons with the field because we're doing this at small laboratory scale, but it looks a lot like the field images that we have of outward migrating planiforms in mud belts. Okay, this is some sediment waves from the Adriatic margin here. And let's see what the model says. Again, we can't be absolutely sure that these are the same phenomenon. But there's a pretty strong resemblance. Note these steps are migrating landward. Okay. Here are our conclusions. Dissolved salt plays an important role in the dispersal of sediment supplied to the oceanic environment. Hypopictal flows contribute to more proximal sediment deposition on shelves than hyperpictal flows. Surface waves act to plane off the surface of the shelf and generated a wave-supported turbidity current. And the long-term autogenic subaqueous process described above self-generates the self-morphology associated with the seaward migrating claniform without any allogenic effect such as sea level variation. Again, we are not claiming that sea level variation is unimportant, and we're not claiming that these sequence stratigraphic models are wrong, because sea level change has played an extremely important role in the shelves we see today. However, right now, at what used to be more or less still stand, for thousands of years, shelves have been building out in mud belts according to the mechanism described here. We published this work in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science last year. There's the name of it, and feel free to have a look. The talk is essentially over, but I'll just go very quickly over some slides that people might want to look at in detail later on. This is our hypothesis. This is the idea of drowned ancient coastal plains as being shelves. This shows the parameters that we used for our simple laboratory scale numerical model. So they're quite small compared to reality, but it's a place to start. And you don't have to look at the details now, but if you're interested, they're there. Okay, this defines hypo and hyperpictal flow. And these are the equations of the hydrodynamic model that we used. It's a Reynolds average model. It's not large eddy simulation. It's not direct numerical simulation, but it's what we could do. Here's the turbulence closure model. And equations for the conservation of suspended sediment and dissolved salt. Density of the fluid according to excess density to salt and due to suspended sediment. This summarizes the relationships we used to treat waves. It's simplified, of course. And that finishes my talk. We'll go back to the conclusion slide. I'm done. Thank you very much. So I guess the floor is open to questions if anybody has any. Now to say that. Well, can you hear me? Michael, you're saying something, but you're muted.
Okay, now
I can unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying that I can't unmute myself. Yeah, actually, this made me start thinking about a place that I've been working in, the Marmara Sea, which alternates between freshwater and saltwater, and that might be an interesting place. It's during low stand, it gets disconnected from the Aegean and turns into a freshwater lake. And during high stand, it gets flooded and turns into, as in now, a saltwater sea. And it would be interesting to see what, there are some small rivers and small deltas, but it'd be interesting to see how things might change during those sea level cycles with this in mind.
It sounds like a great site and an exciting idea to do. So if anybody has a multi-beam, invite me on a cruise.
Okay, well, the multi-beam's mostly been done in the deep water, not on the shallow water. We have a little bit, but there's a lot of seismic data of different resolutions that we have, including including low stand deltas that have been imaged. Because during low stand, basically the shelf becomes exposed, and there are low stand deltas that go out onto the basin.
Okay.
So let's talk about that.
Let's do so.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
So I think our next on the list, Clark. Hey, Gary, that was very interesting. I was curious about your upslope migrating bed forms. Do you have is that just because of the velocity of the flows moving down the edge into the deeper water, or is it something with the model? What do you think is going on there?
Well, actually, we know what's going on. And this goes back to a bit of an anecdote. I had a student working with me, Svetlana Kostic, and I gave her the job of modeling what turbidity currents would do at sharp slope breaks. And she was using one of our models, and she came back and said, the model's unstable. I can't get it to stabilize. I looked at the results and it said, your model's not unstable. It's modeling mud waves. And it's associated with turbidity currents that spontaneously change from Froude subcritical to Froude supercritical hydraulic jump, subcritical, supercritical hydraulic jump. And these form in the laboratory nicely. They come out of the numerical models in the way they ought to. And in the case of the ones that you saw, what's happening is that sediment is raining down from the hypopictal plume, but waves are stirring up a wave-supported turbidity current that is driven over the slope break, and that turbidity current causes the mud waves. So we think there is an alternative explanation in terms of internal waves, but that's what we think is going on. It's the wave-supported turbidity currents accelerating as they go over the edge.
You certainly see something that looks similar, on the eel shelf in the Humboldt slide. There was always this discussion about landward migrating sediment waves, but they were right after the hyperpycnal flows would be plunging over the edge of the slide head.
My money is on those as mud wave cyclic steps. I don't claim to be right all the time, but that's where my money is.
Okay, thanks.
Jimmy.
Now to say something.
Hi, thank you very much for interesting talk. So my question is, in your numerical experiments, mostly the final bathymetry of the shelf was around 1 meter. And I'm curious about the governing parameter of the final depth of the shelf, because
Yes.
is it determined purely by wave intensity, or the sediment flux also determined
The main, it's a combination of the two. Okay, more sediment raining down is going to make it higher. So there's a tendency always to build it higher and higher. But as you work your way into wave base, the wave action becomes stronger and stronger, taking it away. So it's a balance between the two.
Okay, so we can expect in a natural case that if the bathymetry of the shelf different depending on the sediment input, and it could be determined by the wave supported turbidity current in that shelf.
That's what our model suggests. It might not be right, but at least that's what it suggests.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Gary. I enjoyed your talk, and I particularly enjoyed it because it gives us a testable hypothesis, right? If these are formed by hypopycnal flow, or if they're a significant component, then there must be very specific expectations with regards to grain size and bed thickness and things like that are producing these things. Have you started to go through or collaborate with anyone to actually test how much of a continental shelf is made out of these kinds of deposits?
No, we haven't. The only thing I can say right now is that you need mud. Sand doesn't work. Right. Sand will simply rain out very, very proximally. So in terms of grain size, you're looking at mud. As for the broader testing, no, we've not done that yet. But one of the ideas of giving this seminar is to throw the idea out and see if other researchers develop an interest to test them, for better or for worse. And I say that partly in recognition of the fact that I'm going to retire next year.
Okay, so can I ask just a quick follow-up? How much how much of these mud deposits would you need on a shelf to say that they're actually a significant component of it? So if you looked at a bunch of core and you found that only 10% of it was made out of these kinds of deposits, would that be enough to say this is in your mind, a particular constructor of, or a significant constructor of shelves?
Okay, I'm not sure if this is the answer that will help you, but for example, some shelves are very sandy.
Yeah.
Those were not created by the mechanisms we described in the numerical model, for sure.
Okay, thank
Gary?
you.
And
Go ahead.
Kevin,
I agree. There's
yeah.
a lot of shelves, really vary as to how sandy or muddy they are and where that transition is. But if you're building a shelf with that mud, the sand is still going to deposit on top of that. And so, wouldn't you be able to, as long as you have at least some mud, still have that mixed shelf with, the inner part being sandy and the outer part being muddy?
Okay, I'm going to think on my feet here. You simply can't hold sand in a hypopictal plume. The fall velocity is too high. So it deposits out approximately in the delta. However, if the wave action is there and if the mud shelf has built up high enough, I assume the shelf could start to access the sand of the delta and bring it out too.
Yeah, right. That's what
It would be an indirect phenomenon, but I assume that could happen.
Yeah. Because like even on the Eel River shelf, that sand mud transition was at 60 meters water depth. So the outer shelf was mud, but the inner shelf was sand. And I presume that the sand is depositing proximally and just getting, swept farther out onto the shelf. But that shelf then, it needs that mud platform so that it doesn't go into the deep water.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right.
Okay, Kevin.
Hi, this is Kevin Xu from LSU. I have a question regarding the threshold sediment concentration to trigger hyperpycnal. So in your model, you have not only salinity, but also wave. So in many coastal estuaries, the salinity can be somewhere between 0 and 25 parts per thousand. So if we use the Yellow River as an example, if the salinity is 5 ppt or 10 ppt in your model, what will be the threshold concentration to trigger hyperpycnal?
Oh, well, I got to compute it. It's simply a matter of using the equation of state to find density as a function of sediment concentration and temperature and salt concentration. So I'd have to compute it. But I think maybe the point you're getting at is the 40,000 milligrams per liter is an overall average for seawater as a whole. And in many estuarine environments, the seawater is brackish. It's not nearly so heavy. And in that case, the mechanisms that I described might be sort of mixed a bit with other processes. In particular, in brackish estuaries, the surface plume can settle out, but then make a fairly strong turbidity current on the bottom that is a secondary turbidity current. It's from material settling out of the plume that then go on and rework the system.
Okay.
So yeah, the brackish case is sort of ambiguous. I use the 40,000 milligrams per liter as a way of illustrating two end member cases.
Okay. If wave and salt are both in the system, do you think the threshold concentration will decrease or increase?
If what? What was the first
part?
part?
So if you have brackish water, you have a little bit of salt. In the meantime, you also have strong waves. Then the required concentration to trigger hyperpycnal would be higher or lower than salt only.
Okay, I'll answer the best I can. I might be wrong, but whether the flow comes in as hyper or hypopycnal has nothing to do directly with waves. It simply has something to do with the density of sediment-laden water versus the water of the receiving basin. Okay. And as you go to less and less concentrations of dissolved salt, a more brackish environment, then the condition for hyperpictal flows becomes easier. And it makes it a little easy to create bottom turbidity currents. The role of waves comes in once the hypo or hyperpictal flow has met the receiving basin. And it's the strength of the wave action can determine what sizes what kind of wave supported turbidity current you can make and what sizes you then move offshore. So we haven't done the brackish case, but it's interesting. And as I showed you in that very first experimental video, even in a hypopictal case, the sediment raining out from the plume can, at least initially, create a secondary turbidity current, which would suppress the formation of a shelf, maybe lower the speed at which it's created.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope I'm right.
Yeah. Gary, thank you very much for this effort. Traditionally, many people talk about the continental shelf margin formation by the cross-shelf transport, that
Yes.
classic sequence stratigraphy.
Yeah.
But only in the last 20 years, only, maybe, a little bit more than 30 years. So the longshore drift have brought to attention for us understand the feet of those river derived sediment, like all the way from Amazon, the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Pearl River, and many, even the recent Irrawaddy River. That's a big portion of the sediment have already left the river mouth, then drift along the shore. And so that's some part, we are missed. We try our best in the last 20 years, try to emphasize there's also a distal depot center, what's the proximal depot center. I think, you and your colleague, Tashiki, I think a very good effort, very good direction. My question is, looks like this longshore drift, like Amazon, like Yangtze, like the Mekong, like the Pearl River in Adriatic Sea, happened during the sea level stabilized high stand condition, But this sea level high stand, it looks like a little bit longer than the previous one. If you look at the 5, last interglacial or the last 1 million years, the high peak is, the high stand very short and less than 1,000 years. But now we have more than 7,000 years. It looks like maybe continue another 1,000 years. How this long-term, sea level relatively stable help to build the shelf, and how, based on our observation, looks like most of the shelf is stop growing because the wave become very strong. The longshore current, change, modify. What's your opinion about, this Holocene high stand sea level and the formation of the shelf compare the old record, the past very short high stand sea level geological period?
Okay. First of all, the reason we chose to focus on the case of still stand was, number one, we had data from around the world on mud belts, and number two, according to the standard stratigraphic model, that's the wrong condition for shells to form. Mm-hmm. According to the stratigraphic model, sea level has to change for shells to form. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we chose that again, like as a antithesis of the standard model. But the standard model is still there, and it's still real in the case of many shelves. And although I can't do it, it's not that difficult to put base level rise and fall into the model we just showed you. And at least from that model, make some interpretations about the role of baselevel rise and fall. And from that, try and figure out how the two mechanisms combine. There's one comment I will make is the standard wisdom from sequence stratigraphy was that at low stand, there was no shelf anywhere in the world.
Mm.
Low stand only lasted for about 6,000 years. The last low stand.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
You can say that's somewhat of an old model. They've gone back on that and admitted that there is a shelf even at low stand.
Oh, wow. Give me the paper.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I'm excited.
Yeah. No,
I don't talk with you enough, Mike.
Right. Yeah, we definitely need to sit down and talk some.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, in my the reconstructions in New Jersey, I find often at low stand, I'm getting 50, 60 meter depths for the cliniform. So yeah, the shelf goes out, but rarely does it make it all the way to the shelf edge. It's just we had such a big sea level change this last time that in many places it did and planed off what would be the natural cliniform shape.
Thank you.
Very good. Anybody else? And I appreciate Gary. Today you gave a very short talk relatively, but give us enough time to discuss. Anybody else? Any comments you want to add? Any question?
Well, then if I have time, I can tell you a funny story. Once at the American Geophysical Union, a student gave a presentation, and he clearly had never given a presentation in his life. And he has 15 minutes. After 13 minutes, he shows no sign of ending. He's told to stop, but he doesn't. He keeps going until 15 minutes. And he says, I jumped to the conclusions. And he showed one slide with 5 conclusions, and then another slide with 5 more conclusions, and then a slide with 4 conclusions, 14 conclusions. So sometimes it's good not to go overtime.
Very good tip.
Thanks so much. And again, Paul, thanks for organizing this.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So, Gary, thank you. I think your talk will, like a nuclear seed, stir up a little bit of the pot. I mean, that's exactly what we need. I think this direction we need to pay more attention for numerical modeling and combine. So, if no question, I think thank you, Gary, very much. Thank you for everybody. Anybody, if you want to give a talk, please let us know. We need your contribution. And so, okay, Gary, thank you. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.